I'm Teresa Carraggio, and this is Third Paradigm. My topic today is Nuland Unmasked as Umbridge. This is a reposting of the very first video that I put on Substack, which looked at Escape from Azkaban and looked at a similarity between Dolores Umbridge, the arch-villainess of the Harry Potter series, and Victoria Nuland. I think that this is a really fun comparison, especially if you know both worlds. For me, it was at the very beginning of my discovery of things like the Maidan coup and the U.S. sociopathic neocon meddling in Ukraine. But it also was prescient in ways that I'm going to point out as we go through this intro and look at these patterns. Nuland, of course, has just resigned, but maybe it's too early to dance on the graves of those globalists who seem to be dying like that, and the resignation letters. Maybe this is part of a deep occult pattern that we should be paying attention to and learning how to do defense against the dark arts. I've also included a full transcript on Substack, so that should help for those who aren't familiar with Dolores Umbridge. The similarities between these two characters are eerie, down to the birth date, the title, the middle name, and the simpering style of an exterior girlish weakness, and then inside this vicious, sadistic cunning. So there's another villainess that I really like, if you can say that about a villainess, in the K-drama called Vincenzo, which is a mafia one that's really fun. And she has that same kind of combination. I think that this is something that J.K. Rowling certainly didn't intend, but there's a trail of breadcrumbs that I think are being left for us in order to figure this out. And this is an important clue. And for those who do know both the Harry Potter worlds and the Ukrainian drama, this, I think, is an especially clever episode and certainly my most ambitious. The original episode focuses on the geopolitical similarities, but 2 years later, I think we've moved fully into the occult and the dark arts. For those who've seen my episodes, you know that I don't believe in the existence of evil, much less supernatural evil. But I am certain that those who are engineering world events do. And in this case, I think there's an attempt to bring back the Antichrist, to turn this into a remembering of the dismembering of perhaps Osiris. And that if we look at Voldemort as something that was broken into pieces, in these horcruxes, horcruxes also is Horus and crux. So Horus, the god, and the cross, which may add more potential to my idea that I think that Jesus is actually the Antichrist, is the representation that the Christ is not all of us put together, but is one special person better than all the rest. What I couldn't have said 2 years ago is that the U.S. and NATO back in Ukraine were never meant to win against Russia. Ukraine from the beginning was meant to be a blood sacrifice of the willing. And it's no surprise that the Jewish Zelensky and Nuland are partnering with the Azov battalion, who are Nazis. Remember that in Hebrew, there are no vowels. And so Nazi and Zion are both the same, except backwards. They're both NZ or ZN. This has been confirmed by a Last Vagabond episode that I saw recently called Zionism versus Nazism, Israel's Connection to Extremist Ideology. In addition to other evidence that I've cited elsewhere, looking at things like the transfer agreement, It says that National Socialism was never Nazi until a 1923 agreement with Hitler right at the time of the Beer Hall Putsch, and that they would back him, and that then they took the first two letters of National Socialist and the first two letters of Zionist and combined them to make Nazi. I have links to all of these videos in my Substack. So Ukraine has now been cleared out to make way for a new Israel, for a home for the wannabe gods. And the usurped land of Canaan is being cleared of Canaanites, Palestinians, who are being lured by food trucks because they are in starvation mode, have not eaten for over a week. And then they're being mowed down, shot in the hundreds. This is a full-on sacrifice zone, and something really nefarious is going on that does affect, of course, the Palestinians, but is also something that's a very short-term plan in terms of the Israelis. I think they are also on the sacrifice block. Vanessa Bailey reports on what's being called the Flower Massacre, and also on the Google-partnered Israeli intelligence AI program that is called the 8200 unit. This is a drone program that figures out using AI what its target should be for assassination. These are called things like Gospel and The Alchemist. Can there be any doubt about that? And I'm curious about the biblical significance of 8200. I remember there's some number that you get when you add all the ages together of the patriarchs. Another video by Israeli insider David Sheen is called Messiah Mode, and this is a shockingly candid and detailed account of this short sprint to godhood that's going on right now. I think that has to be watched to be believed. It's been on YouTube now for 4 years and hasn't been taken down, so watch it while you can. Others are linking the recent deaths of Kissinger and Rothschild to an occult ritual to bring about the apocalypse. And are we sure that they're even really dead? Could this Canaanite bloodletting, along with the 10,000 animals that they're going to be sacrificing at the third temple, be some ritual that they're looking at turning them immortal? Maybe that's what all this desperation is about. Really Graceful has done one on Lord Rothschild that I think is very interesting in terms of tying together all of the occult. And finally, Pashin of Diva Drops has posted a demonic changing of the guards, which links to a Rumble video that features Mel Gibson, but maybe only as clickbait. But the pattern that it shows of global elites dying off and what's really behind that is an interesting thing to watch. Is Nuland's resignation part of this pattern of either taking the final bow or going behind the scenes for the final act? It's too soon to dance on anyone's grave or resignation letter, in my opinion. But things have moved into the final bloodbath in this world, if not the next. In my video, I have a strategy for what our defense against the dark arts should be. Although it's something millennia old, I don't think it's ever been more timely. So let's go into the third paradigm Wayback Machine and see what I had to say back when Ukraine was a neocon wet dream and Nuland was a cherubic devil in a blue suit dress. Witches and wizards of Hogwarts, I have dire news. Dolores Umbridge has escaped from Azkaban, where she was sent for crimes against humanity, those who we disparagingly call Muggles and mudbloods. She's gone back in time into the Muggle world, where she's hiding in the body of a woman named Victoria Nuland, another state functionary with the same MO, that the ends justify the means. And what are the ends? Same as they ever were. Same as they ever were, I think, is a Freudian slip that I've now made twice, so I'm going to leave it in. They are, first, world domination by her and her kind. Two, pure blood supremacy. In our world, this was wizards over Muggles and mudbloods. In the Muggle world, this is Euro-Americans and Eurocranians in this particular instance. And then brutal quashing of any criticism of her authority. And for this, she is willing to risk the return of Voldemort, who we mistakenly thought was a person. And now we understand that it was the horcruxes, the weapons of mass destruction themselves, that were Voldemort, world death. And so first, let's look, for those of you who don't remember Umbridge's reign of terror, let's look at who she is, and then we'll look at Victoria Nuland. What's the first impression we get of Madame Dolores Jane Umbridge, born August 1961 or earlier? J.K. Rowling writes, "When they entered the Defense Against the Dark Arts classroom and saw Professor Umbridge in a fluffy pink cardigan with a black velvet bow on top of her head, Harry was reminded of a large black fly perched unwisely on top of an even larger toad." Dolores Umbridge is what Hannah Arendt might call the banality of evil, but in this case more the bureaucracy of evil. She has an exterior sweetness, a simpering sucking up to authority, which she exploits when it is weak and insecure and paranoid, and then a condescension to everyone else. But she's so innocuous that the power that she's wielding is almost invisible. In her first speech at Hogwarts, Dolores is so dull and boring that no one actually understands what she's saying other than Hermione, who gets that she's not going to teach them any defense against the dark arts. What she's going to teach is theory, because there's no real threat anymore, and that they are on their own to be able to figure out what's really going on. When Harry insists that the threat of world destruction is real and Voldemort has returned, she gives him detention in her pink office decorated with pictures of kittens, where he must write with the black quill, "I must not tell lies," that cuts it into his hand as he writes. Fortunately for Harry, disinformation had not come yet into vogue. She ordered a false flag dementor attack on Harry, figuring that if the dementor sucked out his soul with a dementor's kiss, that then she would win, and if Harry killed the dementor, then she would expel him on a technicality for using underage magic, because of course there never really was a dementor. When students started meeting in secret to train each other, she forbid any groups of 3 or more from getting together, shut down common areas, restaurants and bars like Hogsmeade, shut down sports teams unless she made an exception, and she formed an inquisitorial guard, which was students snitching out each other while she was the High Inquisitor. After Mad-Eye Moody was killed, she took his eye and installed it on her office to give everyone the impression that she could see everything they were doing at all times. When Harry was interviewed about Voldemort, she made it an expellable offense to read the Quibbler, which just made everyone want to read it. As undersecretary to a weak and gullible minister of magic, she passed werewolf legislation laws that made it so that they couldn't work, making them easy prey to be recruited by Voldemort. When Voldemort became the Minister of Magic, she oversaw Muggle registration and therefore terrorized those who were of mixed ethnic descent. Now let's look at Victoria Nuland. Let's start by looking at how Voldemort was defeated the first time in the form of weapons of mass destruction with the potential for world death. In 1975, international treaties had banned the use of biological or chemical weapons and their development, and according to Wikipedia, all such labs had been dismantled, leaving the only threat as nuclear, primarily between the U.S. and Russia. In 1990, when Victoria Nuland was the deputy director for the State Department to Russia, George H.W. Bush signed an agreement with Mikhail Gorbachev to take down the Berlin Wall and reunify Germany as a European country and a member of NATO. In return, what Russia got was the assurance that NATO would never move 1 inch to the east. Recently, I found out that guarantee and assurance are different words in English, but are the same in both Russian and Ukrainian. And so, while a guarantee seems unequivocal, an assurance makes an ass out of you and yours, because since then, Yugoslavia was bombed, and NATO has absorbed Poland, Hungary, Bulgaria, Romania, the Baltic states, the Czech Republic, Albania, Croatia, and more, starting with the next administration, which was Clinton. And so maybe that meant an inch on a very small map. So who is Victoria Jane Nuland, born July 1961? And for those of you who don't believe that there are forces at work on our side, I knew before I looked it up her middle name was going to be Jane. And the Weasley twins are already up to their pranks because the Wikipedia blurb on the search page read, Victoria Nuland is a U.S. diplomat and devil. I'm sure it's been taken down by now. Victoria Nuland is Ukrainian Jewish by ethnicity. Her father was a surgeon, her mother a housewife, but she married into the royal family of neoconservatives. Her husband is Robert Kagan, the co-founder of Project for a New American Century. Now, one of their projects was to convince Americans that Saddam Hussein was helping al-Qaeda, even though they were arch enemies. They convinced Americans to invade on the basis of the weapons of mass destruction, that little vial that Colin Powell once held out. Now, that vial has been the only thing ever found in Iraq in terms of weapons of mass destruction, despite 1,200 investigators who have been searching ever since. In the first 3 years of the Nuland American Century, she was the representative to NATO under George W. Bush when they rejected the Afghan offer to help extricate al-Qaeda and instead decided to invade Afghanistan. In the next 2 years, she was the principal foreign policy advisor to Vice President Dick Cheney, former CEO of Halliburton. She convinced him that regime change in Iraq would be simple. Since then, there are 1 million Iraqis dead, there are thousands of American soldiers killed, and hundreds of thousands with PTSD. The next 3 years, she was the U.S. ambassador to NATO, rallying support for the occupations of Afghanistan and Iraq. Halliburton has been the top profiteer on that, with a total of $40 billion and counting. In 2011, Victoria Nuland was the spokesperson for Hillary Clinton on Libya. Now, I write about Libya extensively in my book, How to Dismantle an Empire, in a chapter called Swept Away by the Currency. I look at how Gaddafi had nationalized the oil revenues and used them to raise the social welfare. He created a minimum wage, he lowered the exorbitant rents that were being charged by property owners, raised the literacy rate from 20% to 90%. He created the man-made river, the largest irrigation system that had ever existed. But in particular, Gaddafi was working with the president of the Ivory Coast to create the Pan-African dinar. There are 14 countries that are held hostage to France through the African franc. So they don't own their own currency. They have what I call currency colonialism. And so this would have given them a way out of that. Instead, NATO bombed Gaddafi's convoy. An angry mob sodomized him with a bayonet. He was killed with a French assassin's bullet to the head, and his body was left in a refrigerator. So before his body was even cold, those insurgents in suits had created a new central bank of Benghazi and had signed an oil deal with Qatar. So that is another thing that has created havoc ever since. And Hillary Clinton's response was, "We came, we saw, he died." In 2012, Nuland said that the U.S. is on the side of those wanting peaceful change in Syria. And so to the peaceful protesters, she transferred the entire military stockpile of Libya, plus U.S. sniper rifles, rocket-fired grenades, and howitzer missiles. Before we get into 2014 and Ukraine, let's go back 20 years to a major victory against Voldemort and world death. This was the Treaty on the Non-proliferation of Nuclear Weapons, which had been signed by Russia, the US, and the UK. But in 1994, they added Belarus, Kazakhstan, and Ukraine. This was called the Budapest Memorandum. At that time, Ukraine had the third largest nuclear arsenal in the world, but they didn't have the trigger for it. Russia did. And so in order to lower the nuclear threat and allow Ukraine its independence, Russia agreed to pay $2.5 billion in forgiven oil and gas debt and to give them fuel for their nuclear power reactors, to pay them for the uranium, and to dismember those reactors in order to bring them back to Russia. The U.S. put in, I think, $600 million in order to help with that de-escalation. And the agreement between all three parties, U.S., UK, and Russia, was that they would respect the sovereignty and the borders of these countries, that they wouldn't allow any military or nuclear threat. They also would not use economic coercion, particularly for political influence. Now let's go to late 2013, when Nuland is the Assistant Secretary of State for Europe and Eurasia. The president of Ukraine is Yanukovych, and he desperately wants a deal with the EU and the IMF, but the deal they are offering him sucks. When he reads the fine print, he realizes that that $5 billion loan is going to require $3.5 billion to be repaid a year for his predecessor's loan. In addition, it will raise the cost of oil and gas by 40%. He's going to need to put in austerity measures, including raising the retirement age, freezing pensions, and state wages. In return, Russia offers a deal of 14 billion euros. And with that, the cost of oil and gas would be decreased by 30%. So Yanukovych turns down the EU, and that's when the Maidan Square uprising happens. Tens of thousands of Ukrainians who want closer ties to Europe start protesting. But soon that protest gets taken over by more extreme factions, neo-Nazis, Islamic militants, and ultra-nationalist Ukrainians who want a pure-blood Ukraine. Now, that isn't my words. That was in the reporting that I was reading. And in another gift to my theme, it really is true that Victoria Nuland and John McCain handed out cookies at the uprising. Oh, here's one with a swastika for you. Here's one totally halal, and I'm sure you want the pure vanilla. In February of 2014, Victoria Nuland and the U.S. ambassador to Ukraine have the infamous phone call that is leaked onto the internet. In it, Victoria is saying, we need to glue this fast and fuck the EU. We can make this our own if we get behind it and make sure that we get this off the ground before Russia shoots it down. In it, they debate who is the best person to put in charge as prime minister. And Nuland says, Yats is our guy. When they talk about how they're going to manage the personalities, that they say they need an international presence, and Nuland says, Biden is with us. The ambassador says, if we move fast, we can land jelly side up on this. Then on February 18th, there's a sniper firing from a building that kills 100 protesters and police. The building is controlled by the ultra-nationalists, but Yanukovych is blamed for it. And so now a scholar has done extensive research and says that it is highly credible that that was from the neo-Nazi faction doing a false flag attack on their own protest. This seems confirmed by something that was said by the leader of that neo-Nazi group in February of this year, which is, "The West gave us weapons because we do the job. We have fun killing. We have started a war that hasn't been seen for 60 years. We are a huge, powerful state, not to join Europe, but to make new political alliances. This was a nationalist movement and not LGBT, and foreign embassies say that there were not many Nazis, only 10%, real ideological ones." He laughs. "Only a moron who didn't understand war would say these 10%, even only 8%, are much more effective, and without them the effectiveness would have dropped by 90%. If not for nationalists, that whole thing would have turned into a gay parade." But because of the attacks and what they've done to his reputation, Yanukovych negotiates a peace agreement with the right mediated through the EU. And that says that he will move elections up by 9 months, which was supposed to happen in a year, and he will restrict his power until then. That is signed, and then the ultra-right rejects it and steps up their violence and starts taking over government buildings. So Yanukovych flees, and Yats becomes our guy as the Ukrainian president. One of the first things is that they rescind that Russian can be the second official language, although for many people there it is their first language. Then there is an attack on Odessa. Odessa is a beautiful seaport town, very cosmopolitan, Mediterranean in style. It was the third largest city in Ukraine, and as part of Imperial Russia was the fourth largest city. And people are protesting peacefully when the factions arrive and round them up and herd them into a trade union building, which is then set on fire so that people are burnt alive. So what was our hurry to get this glued, to land jelly side up, to get this launched before the Russians torpedoed it? The Sochi Olympics were happening in Russia, and they ended on February 23rd. Our man Yats filled 5 of his top cabinet positions with members of the ultranationalists, including defense and security. The neo-Nazi battalion was one of the first to be trained by the U.S. military, who has also supplied $5 billion in weapons since. In the spring of 2014, the Donbass region started fighting for its own independence. Since then, 14,000 people have been killed, the vast majority ethnic Russians. And as if the return of a nuclear Voldemort wasn't enough, in the latest twist, Nuland has admitted that Ukraine has biological research facilities that we are afraid of Russia getting their hands on. According to China, the U.S. has over 300 biological labs that are researching weapons of mass destruction, and that 27 are located in Ukraine alone. The questions I think we need to answer are 3. 1, do international treaties apply, like the one on NATO, even when there's a new democratically elected administration? 2, did the U.S. violate the Budapest Memorandum when we got involved in the overthrow of the government with the coup? And 3, does the Budapest Memorandum obligate Russia to respect the borders of a country whose government has been taken over in a coup, or does it obligate them to defend those who trusted the memorandum to protect them when Russia withdrew? And I want to end by quoting from Defense Against the Dark Arts professor Dorothy Sayers from 1947. And she talks about how we no longer know how to construct an argument and how to detect fallacies in argument. We let our young men and women go out unarmed in a day when armor was never so necessary. By teaching them all to read, we've left them at the mercy of the printed word. By the invention of the film and the radio, we have made certain that no aversion to reading shall secure them from the incessant battery of words, words, words. They do not know what the words mean. They do not know how to ward them off or blunt their edge or fling them back. They are prey to words in their emotions instead of being the masters of them in their intellects. We who were scandalized in 1940 when men were sent to fight armored tanks with rifles are not scandalized when young men and women are sent into the world to fight massed propaganda with a smattering of subjects, and when whole classes and whole nations become hypnotized by the arts of the spellbinder. We have the impudence to be astonished. We dole out lip service to the importance of education, lip service and just occasionally a little grant of money. We postpone the school leaving age and plan to build bigger and better schools that teachers slave conscientiously in and out of school hours, and yet, as I believe, all this devoted effort is largely frustrated because we have lost the tools of learning and in their absence can only make a botched and piecemeal job of it. And for more of my recent thoughts, here is Kissinger and the Balfour Declaration to look at the original ghouls, and this is the playlist on Russia and Ukraine. Thank you for watching.